What happens when a tragedy is too big to forget? It becomes a ghost story. A fire that claims a theater, a ship that never makes it to port, or a crime with no answers. These events leave a scar on a city that never quite heals. Today, we aren't just telling scary stories. We are digging up the real events behind them. We're traveling from the battlefields of Gettysburg to the foggy coast of San Francisco to look at 31 legends that prove the past is never truly dead. Some are famous. Many are local, passed along in small towns and big cities like family folklore. All of them remind us that the past does not always stay quiet. Number 1. Resurrection Mary of Chicago. Along Archer Avenue near Resurrection Cemetery outside Chicago, drivers have long reported a familiar story. A young woman in a pale dress appears late at night, asks for a ride, and then vanishes near the cemetery gates. In most versions, she seems confused, cold, or quietly sad. The tragedy beneath the tale is the era of early automobile accidents and late-night dance halls, when a young person could leave a night of music and never arrive home. Over decades, the vanishing hitchhiker becomes personal and local, with details attached to real roads, real cemeteries, and real grief. Whether Mary was ever one person or many, the legend keeps returning to the same idea. A life ended suddenly, and a community cannot quite stop looking for the missing. Number 2. The Eastland Disaster Ghost. In 1915, the passenger ship Eastland capsized in the Chicago River while still near the dock, killing more than 800 people in a matter of minutes. It was one of the deadliest maritime disasters in American history, and it struck working families especially hard. In the years that followed, stories spread about wet footprints in riverfront buildings, voices heard where no one stood, and a heavy feeling near the water on certain mornings. Some versions place sightings on the river itself, as if figures are still trying to climb out. The legend draws power from the suddenness of the tragedy. People were not crossing an ocean, they were taking a short outing. That contrast between ordinary plans and mass death is exactly where haunting stories tend to root. Number 3. The Iroquois Theater Fire and the Restless Balcony. In 1903, a fire tore through the Iroquois Theater in Chicago during a performance, killing more than 600 people. The loss was made worse by locked exits, confusion, and inadequate fire safety measures. Afterward, Chicago gained stronger safety reforms, but the theater's reputation never fully recovered. Over time, urban legends formed around the idea that the building never truly emptied. People described seeing figures in old-fashioned clothing, especially near the upper levels, or hearing a faint rush as if a crowd were trying to move through a corridor. Whether these stories began with workers, performers, or passers-by, they became a way to say what the facts already showed. Those deaths were not only tragic, they were preventable. The ghosts became a moral memory. Number 4. Triangle Shirtwaist Ghosts in New York City. In 1911, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in New York City killed 146 garment workers, many of them young immigrant women. Some died from smoke and flame, others jumped from upper floors when escape routes failed. The tragedy helped drive labor reforms, but it also produced a lasting urban legend, that the building and the streets around it are still visited by the dead. People have claimed to smell smoke on otherwise ordinary days, to hear faint shouting, or to see a figure in a window where no one should be. These stories persist partly because the event is so vivid in the public imagination. The legend is less about proving a haunting and more about refusing to let the victims be reduced to a number. The city remembers through narrative. Number 5. The General Slocum Fire and the River That Remembers. In 1904, the steamboat General Slocum caught fire in the East River in New York City, and more than 1,000 people died, many from a German-American community that never recovered in the same way. The horror of a burning ship so close to shore created a particular kind of folklore. Stories of cries over the water, apparitions on foggy mornings, and boats that pass a certain stretch of river and suddenly feel an unnatural chill. The legend often focuses on sound, which makes sense. Water carries noise in strange ways, and grief carries it farther. In river cities, a disaster becomes part of the landscape. Even as the neighborhood changes, the river stays and people keep imagining that it remembers. Number 6. Galveston Storm Spirits. The Galveston hurricane of 1900 remains one of the deadliest natural disasters in American history, killing thousands along the Texas coast. Entire blocks were destroyed, and the scale of loss reshaped how Americans thought about storms and warnings. In Galveston, urban legends grew around certain streets and old buildings. Phantom footsteps after heavy rain, a woman in drenched clothes searching for children, voices in empty corridors when the weather turns. Storm tragedies often produce legends because the enemy is invisible until it arrives, and because the destruction is so complete that survivors struggle to describe it. Ghost stories become a kind of weather report from the past, a reminder that the sea can change the world in a single night. Number 7. The San Francisco Earthquake Fire Shadows. In 1906, an earthquake and the fires that followed devastated San Francisco. Buildings fell, gas lines ruptured, and the city burned for days. Out of that destruction came a quieter set of stories, that certain hills, alleys, and basements still hold echoes of the displaced. People have told of singing heard near ruins, silhouettes seen where old streets once ran, and the sense that some places go strangely silent, as if sound itself is cautious there. These are not the loud, theatrical ghosts of popular movies. They are the small haunting details that match disaster reality, confusion, smoke, and wandering. In a city rebuilt so quickly, legends sometimes function as a second memorial, marking what new foundations covered. Number 8. The Peshtigo Fire and the Lights in the Trees. On the same night as the more famous Chicago fire in 1871, the Peshtigo Fire in Wisconsin became the deadliest wildfire in American history. It moved with terrifying speed, consuming towns and forests and leaving few places to run. In the region, legends later spoke of strange lights in the woods, as if lanterns were moving through trees where no roads exist, and of voices calling during certain winds. Wildfire tragedies often create this kind of tale because fire behaves like a living thing, changing direction and speed. Survivors described it as a wall, a roar, a storm of flame. A generation later, that language turns into folklore, the dead still searching, the forest still glowing, and the night still carrying the sound of what happened. Number 9. The Cocoanut Grove Fire and the Unfinished Night. In 1942, the Cocoanut Grove nightclub fire in Boston killed hundreds of people in a crowded, dark space where exits were inadequate and panic was immediate. The tragedy influenced fire safety standards nationwide, but it also left an afterimage in local memory. Stories of music that seems to drift from a closed room, the scent of smoke in a hallway that has been repainted, or a mirror that fogs as if someone is standing too close. Nightclub tragedies carry a particular kind of haunting because they begin with celebration. The legend preserves that contrast, turning a place of laughter into a place that feels watchful. Even when the building changes, people keep telling the story because it explains why a crowded room can be dangerous. Number 10. New London School Explosion and the Classroom Echo. In 1937, a natural gas leak caused an explosion at the New London School in Texas, killing students and staff and devastating the community. The aftermath shaped school safety rules, including odorization of gas so leaks can be detected. In the years that followed, legends emerged about voices in empty school corridors, desks that seem to scrape at night, and a clock that stops at the moment of the blast. School tragedies produce especially persistent folklore because the victims were children, and the setting was supposed to be safe. For many communities, a haunting story becomes a way to talk about the unbearable. A normal day, a familiar building, and then sudden absence. Number 11. The Bath School Disaster and the Basement Story. In 1927, the Bath School Disaster in Michigan killed dozens when explosives destroyed part of an elementary school. It remains one of the deadliest school attacks in American history. Local stories later spoke of a persistent feeling near the old grounds, of footsteps where no one walks, and of a child's voice calling a name. Some versions focus on basements and crawl spaces, as if the building itself cannot let the past go. When tragedy comes through deliberate violence, legends often cluster around the idea of unfinished business. People want a story that restores moral order, even if only symbolically. A haunting suggests that something remains to be answered, even when the historical record provides no comfort. Number 12. The Haunted Fields of Gettysburg. The Battle of Gettysburg in 1863 was one of the bloodiest battles of the American Civil War. Thousands died over 3 days, and the landscape itself became a national symbol of sacrifice. It is also one of the most famous haunted places in the country, with stories of ghostly soldiers, phantom drums, and lantern lights moving across fields at night. Many visitors describe hearing distant cannon or murmured voices. It is easy to see why. The battlefield is large, quiet, and heavy with knowledge of what happened there. Legends thrive where history is concentrated and visible. In this case, the haunting stories are less about thrills and more about a nation still trying to comprehend the cost of its own conflict. Number 13. Wounded Knee and the Winter Voices. In 1890, at Wounded Knee Creek in South Dakota, United States troops killed Lakota people in a massacre that remains one of the most painful events in American history. In the surrounding area, stories have circulated about voices in winter wind, figures seen in snow, and the feeling of being watched near the site. These accounts are often told with solemnity rather than excitement. Here, urban legend can feel like the wrong phrase because the tragedy is real and the grief is living. Still, the pattern is familiar. When communities face mass loss, especially loss tied to injustice, stories of lingering presence emerge. They are not entertainment. They are a form of remembrance and sometimes a warning. Number 14. The Ghost Ship of the Great Lakes. The Great Lakes have claimed thousands of ships over centuries of commerce and storms. Out of that history grew recurring legends. Ghost lights over open water, a ship silhouette seen in fog that vanishes when approached, or a bell heard where no buoy exists. Different towns attach these tales to different wrecks and specific details change, but the source remains the same: maritime tragedy on inland seas that can behave like oceans. For sailors and coastal families, a wreck is rarely just a headline. It is a missing person, an unreturned wage, an empty chair. In that kind of grief, the lake becomes a storyteller. A ghost ship is the mind's way of giving form to absence. Number 15. The USS Arizona and the Quiet Below. At Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, the battleship USS Arizona remains a memorial over the shipwreck, where more than 1,000 sailors and Marines died during the attack in 1941. Visitors speak in hushed voices, and many describe an unusual stillness over the water. Over time, legends formed. That tapping is sometimes heard, that a faint singing carries in the wind, or that lights appear beneath the surface as if the ship is still awake. Whether any of that is literal, the tragedy itself is undeniable, and the setting makes folklore almost inevitable. A submerged ship is both tomb and artifact. People stand above it and imagine life continuing below, because imagining is sometimes the only way to face what cannot be changed. Number 16. Centralia and the Town That Will Not Cool. Centralia, Pennsylvania became famous as a near-abandoned town after an underground mine fire began in the early 1960s and continued for decades. As the ground cracked and carbon monoxide rose, families left and the town slowly emptied. From that eerie landscape came modern legends: glowing fissures at night, voices heard near the steam vents, and the claim that the town is cursed. The tragedy here is not a single moment. It is a slow disaster that displaced people over years, leaving behind roads to nowhere and foundations without homes. In places like this, legends often replace community life. When neighbors are gone and buildings disappear, stories move in. The haunting becomes a way to explain why an ordinary town became a warning sign. Number 17. Monongah Mine and the Waiting Lamps. In 1907, an explosion at the Monongah mining complex in West Virginia killed hundreds of miners, devastating families in the region. Mining disasters often produce a specific kind of folklore because the work is already hidden and dangerous. Afterward, people told stories of lights seen near sealed entrances, like lamps still moving in darkness, and of knocks heard through stone. In some versions, the mine breathes, as if it is alive. These legends echo real experiences. Survivors listening for signs, families waiting for names, communities living with the knowledge that bodies were not always recovered. The mine becomes both workplace and grave. Ghost stories in that context are not strange at all. They are grief given a shape people can speak aloud. Number 18. The Donner Party and the Snowbound Figures. In 1846 and 1847, members of the Donner Party became trapped by winter conditions in the Sierra Nevada, leading to starvation and death. The event remains one of the most haunting survival stories in American history. It is no surprise that legends grew around the mountain passes and old trail routes. Tales of figures in the snow that disappear when approached, footprints that end abruptly, or voices calling from whiteout conditions. Mountain tragedies create legends because the environment itself feels alive and indifferent, and because the line between history and imagination blurs in deep winter silence. Whether one believes any sighting, the story functions as a warning. It says, "The mountains do not care about your plans. Respect the season or the past may repeat itself." Number 19. Lost Dutchman Mine and the Curse of the Superstition Mountains. In the Superstition Mountains of Arizona, legends of a rich lost gold mine are tied to stories of disappearances and deaths of would-be prospectors. Some deaths were real, some were exaggerated, and the details are often disputed. Still, the curse became part of the region's folklore, that greed draws people into dangerous terrain, that the mine does not want to be found, and that certain markers appear and vanish. The tragedy beneath the legend is a pattern of risky expeditions into harsh desert and mountain country where heat, dehydration, and misjudgment can kill quickly. A curse story can sound supernatural, but it often points to something practical. It tells listeners, in dramatic language, not to underestimate the land or the desperation of those chasing wealth. Number 20. The Winchester Mystery House and the Inheritance of Death. In San Jose, California, the Winchester Mystery House became famous for its odd architecture. Stairways that lead nowhere, doors that open to walls, and a sprawling layout. The legend claims that Sarah Winchester kept building to confuse the spirits of people killed by Winchester firearms, suggesting her wealth carried a terrible price. The historical tragedy behind the tale is broad rather than singular. Industrial-era violence, war casualties, and the way a single invention can reshape death at scale. While the strict details of the spirit instruction are debated, the legend persists because it fits a moral pattern. It turns guilt and grief into architecture. The house becomes a metaphor. If suffering built your fortune, there is no simple way to live inside it. Number 21. The Hope Diamond Curse in Washington, District of Columbia. The Hope Diamond, now at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, District of Columbia, is surrounded by a popular curse legend. That misfortune follows anyone who owns it. The tragedy behind this story is less about one event and more about how people connect wealth, colonial extraction, and sudden reversals of fortune. Over time, biographies of owners, true and exaggerated, were woven into a single narrative, the jewel as a magnet for disaster. Museums do not present the curse as fact, but the public often loves it because it makes a cold object feel alive and morally charged. In the shadow of historical inequality, a cursed treasure becomes a way to say that some riches carry consequences, even if only in story. Number 22. Salem and the Lingering Trial Bells. The Salem witch trials of 1692 and 1693 resulted in executions and lasting trauma in Massachusetts communities. The tragedy is not only the deaths, but the fear and accusation that tore neighbors apart. Later generations turned that history into legends, that certain houses have cold rooms, that whispers rise near old foundations, that unseen hands touch shoulders in narrow streets. Salem's tourism can sometimes make the past feel theatrical, but the origins are serious. A society panicked and people died for it. Haunting stories thrive where injustice feels unresolved. In Salem, the legend functions as both warning and confession. It says, "Look what fear did here, and if you hear footsteps in the night, perhaps it is the past insisting it still matters." Number 23. The Greenbrier Ghost of West Virginia. In 1897, a young woman named Zona Heaster died in Greenbrier County, West Virginia, and the case became famous for a legend that her spirit returned to accuse her husband. The real history includes an investigation and a trial, and the story became one of America's most repeated ghost narratives. Whether one treats it as folklore or as a dramatic way a community pursued justice, the tragedy is clear: a death surrounded by suspicion and fear. The legend persists because it offers what many people wish existed in such cases: a direct voice for the victim when human institutions fail. It is less about believing in ghosts and more about longing for truth. In that sense, the haunting becomes an argument for accountability. Number 24. Villisca and the House That Would Not Settle. In 1912, 8 people were killed with an axe in Villisca, Iowa, including children. The crime shocked the nation and was never definitively resolved. Out of that uncertainty grew a familiar kind of urban legend: that the house holds sounds of a family at night, that shadows move in doorways, that a child's laughter appears and vanishes. Unsolved crimes are fertile ground for haunting stories because they leave no clean ending. Without a verdict that satisfies the community, the imagination keeps working. A ghost tale becomes a substitute conclusion. The victims remain present, the house remains uneasy, and the crime remains, in some symbolic sense, still happening. The legend is grief turned into atmosphere. Number 25. Amityville and the Shape of Fear in a Family Home. In 1974, a mass murder in a family home in Amityville, New York set the stage for one of the most famous modern haunting stories in America. Later accounts claim the house itself became the source of supernatural terror. The tragedy is the real violence that occurred, and the legend is the haunting narrative that grew around it, amplified through books and films. This is an important case to treat carefully. Sensational stories can eclipse the reality of lives lost. Still, it belongs on this list because it shows how modern America builds legends through media as much as through campfire talk. When a tragedy feels too close, too domestic, too ordinary, a supernatural explanation can feel strangely easier to hold than the plain fact of human violence. Number 26. Lizzie Borden and the Unquiet Upstairs. In 1892, Andrew and Abby Borden were killed in their home in Fall River, Massachusetts. The case became a national obsession, and Lizzie Borden was tried and acquitted, though public suspicion lingered. Over time, the home became the center of urban legends: footsteps on stairs, doors that move, a woman's figure in a mirror. The tragedy behind these stories is not only the murders but the way a community lived with uncertainty, gossip, and the social pressure of a highly public case. When history refuses to settle into a comfortable explanation, legends step in. A haunted house story provides a kind of emotional verdict. It says, "Something is still wrong here," and in the imagination, wrong often takes the form of a presence that will not leave. Number 27. Waverly Hills Sanatorium and the Long Haul. Waverly Hills Sanatorium in Louisville, Kentucky, is often called one of the most haunted places in the country. The real tragedy behind the legend is the tuberculosis era, when sanatoriums held thousands of sick patients, many of whom died before effective antibiotics were widely available. In later decades, stories clustered around the long corridors and service areas. The sound of wheeled carts, coughing in empty rooms, a nurse seen at the end of a hallway. Epidemic tragedies generate hauntings because illness already feels like an invisible invader. People remember not just death, but waiting. In such places, time becomes heavy. A ghost story gives that heaviness a face, and it turns a medical history into a human one. Number 28. Pennhurst and the Voices of an Institution. Pennhurst State School and Hospital in Pennsylvania is remembered for a painful history connected to the institutionalization of people with disabilities. Investigations and public reporting helped expose harmful conditions and contributed to broader reform. Out of this history grew a grim kind of urban legend, that the abandoned corridors still hold cries, that doors slam on their own, that names are whispered. Here, the tragedy is not a single disaster but years of dehumanization. Legends about institutional hauntings are often controversial, and they can easily become disrespectful if treated like entertainment. The more responsible way to understand them is as a public conscience at work. People sense that suffering occurred, and folklore becomes a way to admit it, even when society did not admit it soon enough. Number 29. Trans-Allegheny and the Unseen Crowd. The Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum in West Virginia, like many large 19th-century institutions, represents an era when mental illness was poorly understood, and overcrowding could become extreme. In later years, stories began to circulate of an unseen crowd, murmuring behind doors, footsteps following visitors, distant crying, and the feeling of being watched. The tragedy beneath the legend includes isolation, illness, and the ways families and governments sometimes chose containment over care. Haunting stories in such places often reflect discomfort with that past. They are a way of saying, "We know something happened here," even if the teller cannot name every detail. The legend becomes an echo of social history, carried by architecture that still feels heavy. Number 30. Natchez Trace and the Vanishing Traveler. The Natchez Trace is an ancient travel corridor that became a major route in the early American period. Parts of its history include dangerous stretches where travelers could be robbed or killed, and where disease and hardship were constant companions. From that setting came a recurring legend. A traveler, often a woman, appears along the road or near a bridge, asks for help, and then disappears. Sometimes the story includes an old-style dress. Sometimes it includes a sudden cold wind. This is one of America's most common legend patterns, but the Natchez Trace versions draw strength from real historical vulnerability. Long roads invite imagination, and dangerous roads invite warnings. The vanishing traveler is grief, caution, and history all walking together. Number 31. St. Augustine Lighthouse and the Stairwell Tale. At the St. Augustine Lighthouse in Florida, local legend speaks of apparitions on the stairs, a child's laughter and footsteps that follow visitors. The tragedy behind these stories includes documented accidents and deaths associated with the site and its construction history, as well as the broader reality that coastal work in earlier eras was often dangerous. Lighthouses are perfect stages for urban legends. Isolated towers, narrow stairwells, storms, and the constant presence of the sea. When tragedy is added, the setting becomes unforgettable. Whether people truly see something or simply feel the weight of the past, the stories persist because they match the place. A lighthouse is meant to guide the living through darkness, and folklore often imagines it also guiding the dead. These legends are not history in the strict sense, and they should never replace the facts of what happened or the dignity of the people who suffered. But they do tell us something real about memory. When a tragedy is too large for ordinary conversation, people reach for story. A ghost becomes a way to say, "We did not forget." A curse becomes a way to say, this had a cost. A vanishing traveler becomes a way to say, the road was dangerous and people were lost here. If you listen closely, many of these tales are not asking you to believe in the supernatural. They are asking you to remember the human beings behind the headlines and to notice how the past still shapes the places we live.